presidential flight really started back in 1943. It was a cold January the 7th in Manhattan. By late morning, Pan American pilots Howard Cohn and Dick Vinell got word that something important was about to happen. From Washington, the Navy Department directed that 2 of Pan Am's mammoth transoceanic clippers be readied for a secret mission. Cohn and Vinell were ordered to fly from New York's LaGuardia Marine Terminal to Dinner Key, just outside Miami, Florida. They got there early the next morning. Both pilots were told to prepare for a dawn departure on the 11th. The passenger manifest they got was puzzling. It wasn't until 12 days later that Mrs. Cohn learned who was on board.
It was about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, dark in January, and he went down to the airplane and signed the papers that had to be signed, and he noticed that passenger list was headed by a name Mr. Jones, and the second name was Admiral Leahy and Harry Hopkins and other dignitaries, and it was just at that moment that Howard realized he was carrying President Roosevelt on his first flight in office.
At this West African port fronting the Atlantic Ocean arrives President Roosevelt for his conference with Prime Minister Churchill. He drives in a scout car after having flown across the ocean. It is the first time that he has flown since becoming American president, and he is the only president to travel in a plane while in office.
The contrast between presidential air travel then and now is staggering. The straight line distance between Washington and Casablanca is 3,875 nautical miles. A modern jetliner could have made the trip in just 7 hours. FDR's flight required 4 legs of flying, 3 stopovers, a change of planes, and 3 full days of travel, each way. In addition, the routing touched 3 continents, crossed the equator 4 times, and took nearly 90 hours in the air, President's 61st birthday celebration. When you include round-trip rail transportation from Washington to Miami, President Roosevelt covered some 17,000 miles before he was once more back in the White House. Just weeks after Roosevelt's Casablanca flight, the Army Air Corps brass decided to provide a custom-tailored airplane with the special mission of flying the president. Their choice, the C-57A, Liberator Express. The pilot, Major Henry Myers, christened it Guess Where To. But Roosevelt never flew aboard it. In the fall of 1943, a Douglas C-54 was built and customized for presidential duty. It was known as the Sacred Cow. This aircraft became world famous. For a short time, Cow also served Harry Truman. Then, a custom Douglas DC-6 with a spectacular eagle paint job became the president's plane. In honor of Truman's Missouri hometown, it was called the Independence. FDR opened the era of presidential flight. Harry Truman established it. The men who flew Truman remember him. Flight attendant Bob Hughes.
Normally when we flew, there was a press plane that always went with us carrying some White House people, some Secret Service people, and additional press people. And always they wanted to get down. We would have to circle most of the time before we'd land so they could get in first. And let the photographers and everybody get off and take pictures of him coming off the airplane. So remember one time we were going to Key West for 2 or 3 weeks, and we got down there and he talked to Colonel Myers and he said, Hank, let's just go straight in this time. He says, we'll play a little joke on those guys. So we landed first, and he got a pad and pencil and went down the steps and went over to the press plane when I landed, and he stood at the bottom and jokingly interviewed the press guys coming off the airplane. And they all got a big kick out of it.
Truman's in-flight birthday cake. Independence pilot Frenchie Williams.
Well, the president usually got around to going to Kansas City on his birthday. And the crew would chip in and buy a birthday cake. Big birthday cake, happy birthday, Mr. President, so forth, candles. And this one particular year, we thought we'd go all out. We had this cake made, had it in the galley, So we were going to take it into the president, wish him a happy birthday. And we couldn't get the cake in the door. Big cake right there. We couldn't even tip it up and get it in the door. So we had to go back and say, Mr. President, you'll have to come forward to the galley to cut the cake. And he said, just like the guy that built the boat in the basement.
When Dwight Eisenhower swept into the White House, a Lockheed Constellation was selected from Special Air Missions, or SAM for short. Ike named it Columbine 2, for the flower of his wife Mamie's home state, Colorado. Eisenhower preferred flying to all other kinds of travel. He was also the first American president who was a pilot in his own right. Ike was completely at home in the air. Mamie wasn't. First Officer Bill Thomas and Steward Bob Hughes.
I guess at best you'd describe Mrs. Eisenhower as a timid air traveler, because she did not like to fly without the president.
You know, any weather we saw or encountered en route always bothered her, and she would always call one of us back there, one of the stewards, and say, would you go up front and make sure Bill Draper knows that those things are there out there, those clouds and those thunderstorms?
We might not even have considered it, but she'd have a little note up there asking about that big thunderstorm or that big black area over there. We'd have to come back with a comment that we're not going that way.
Mamie christened Ike's final plane, a super constellation, Columbine 3. In the summer of 1959, Sam accepted delivery of 3 identical new Boeing 707 executive jets. Ike used these 3 interchangeably while retaining Columbine 3 as his official presidential aircraft. Eisenhower's unprecedented 11-nation jet tour started December the 4th. For Ike, it was a stunning whirlwind success. Early in the Eisenhower administration, on board Columbine 2, an incident occurred that would change forever the call sign of an airplane carrying the President of the United States. Taking off from Washington and climbing to 10,000 feet over a certain checkpoint, Columbine called in on a new radio frequency as instructed. Roger 610 answered the controller, and 10 seconds later, another plane's transmission was heard. Center, are you calling Eastern 610? Negative, was the reply. We're calling Air Force 610. This in-flight confusion could have been dangerous. First Officer Bill Thomas.
Well, when we got back, Bill Draper got with the Air Force operations people and with the Federal Aviation Agency and cited this as a reason why we needed a more positive control system. And he recommended that we use Air Force One for the call sign of an airplane when it had the president on board.
Jerry Parr, former Assistant Director, Protective Research, U.S. Secret Service.
The code names are delivered to the Secret Service of a number of code names, and the Secret Service chooses those names on the basis of probably some personal attribute of the person that we protect. For example, with Vice President Humphrey in the mid-60s, his code name was Lightning, which certainly fitted his energetic character, his activism, but basically that's the way we do it.
Through the years, call signs and code names have been specifically useful not only to identify the President and the First Lady and their children, but also key members of the administration, other people, even places and things. John Kennedy, presidential air travel officially entered the jet age. In 1962, Sam took delivery of a Boeing 707 Intercontinental jet, number 26,000, with a striking new exterior designed by Raymond Loewy. It captured perfectly a strong, tasteful sense of national purpose and the American presidency. In late June of 1963, Kennedy embarked on his memorable journey to Berlin. His military aide, Major General Ted Clifton.
It was probably one of the most important diplomatic occasions that occurred in his presidency. It was very important that the Germans be assured and reassured of our faith in them, and it was all planned throughout so that he would bring Germany together as well as bringing us together. And as you know, Chancellor Adenauer and Willy Brandt, who was the mayor of Berlin, were political competitors. And Willy Brandt was working to be the next chancellor. And so we had to handle that very carefully. And again, the president used Air Force One to accomplish something. He just suggested that they both ride with him to West Berlin. And Willy Brandt knew that he would get off the airplane with the president, which was good for him politically. But Adenauer also knew that as the incumbent chancellor, he wasn't being shut out of the game. And Air Force One performed a very important diplomatic mission.
There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin.
Former White House AP correspondent Frank Cormier.
Well, I never saw crowds, I don't think, anywhere in one day as we saw in West Berlin. I suspect 6/5 of the population must have been in the street. It was just enormous. And when he gave that famous speech, and I won't try the German.
President Kennedy had a special way of masking a personal habit he indulged in on board Air Force One. Colonel Joe Soffit explains.
President Kennedy was fond of cigars. Generally, he had a cigar in his mouth when he was ready to deplane from the aircraft. And while they were getting the greeting ceremony ready outside, he would usually have that cigar in his hand. And just before he stepped out of the aircraft, he put that cigar in his left pocket and would walk down the stairs, generally, with his hand in his left pocket. I understand that he had quite a few holes in those suit pockets. Why they didn't make them out of asbestos, I don't know.
On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, it took Air Force One exactly 13 minutes to fly from Carswell Air Force Base, Fort Worth, to Love Field outside Dallas, Texas. It was scarcely long enough for Colonel Jim Swindoll to lift Camelot's new wings above the clouds. The President and Mrs. Kennedy had come to Texas to mend some political fences. Waving aside concerns about hostility, Kennedy ordered that the bullet-resistant bubble top be removed from his limousine. In retrospect, that directive became perhaps the most tragic single order ever given by a president on board Air Force One. The rest became a keenly etched memory for all America and the world.
I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the Trade Mart. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff has just announced that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago.
In the horror and confusion that followed Kennedy's death, Aircraft 26,000 became a place of refuge and security. Before leaving Dallas with the slain president's body and Mrs. Kennedy aboard, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, elected to take the oath of office aboard Air Force One. One of these frames, captured by photographer Cecil Stoughton, became the single most reproduced photograph ever taken aboard a presidential plane. On that hushed and painful flight back to Andrews, Colonel Jim Swindle, Air Force One commander.
And it was almost eerie, quiet, because we didn't have to do much talking. We were on a direct flight, and it's very simple navigation. And FAA gave us anything we wanted, and in hushed tones, everybody was just seemed like they were saluting the president.
For 3 days, television sets across America carried unblinkingly the details of Kennedy's state funeral. There was, at the personal request of Mrs. Kennedy, a final salute from Air Force One and its crew.
Well, she said, Jack loved Air Force One and flying, and said, certainly if it could be arranged, do you suppose they could do the flyover? And it was her idea, and it was said just like that.
Following Kennedy's death, Sam 26,000 became Lyndon Johnson's plane. LBJ rode his big jet like a range boss in a cattle drive, dashing here and there, around the globe, rounding up stray politicians and prime ministers, dispensing his own brand of wisdom, handing out money from the American chuck wagon, radioing ahead for more diet root beer and Texas-sized steaks. It wasn't long before Lyndon Johnson began placing his very special brand, not only in the American presidency, but on the president's plane as well. Former White House correspondent Frank Cormier.
The main passenger cabin forward of his was changed with all the seats reversed, so all the passengers flew backwards. And they looked through a plastic transparent wall at Johnson in what we called his throne chair, and he would be facing forward, facing his fellow passengers.
Flight engineer Joe Chappell.
The president's chair was a large Hartman aircraft seat, and it was designed and installed to fit around or in the kidney-shaped conference table that was electrically operated. We could move the president's desk in the conference area from the coffee table height to the writing desk or dining height.
LBJ also held very strong beliefs about leaders around the world.
Nikita Khrushchev had just been deposed as the premier of the Soviet Union. And Johnson, over a highball, leaned back and said, look around the world. Khrushchev's gone, Nehru's gone, Adenauer's gone, Macmillan's gone, Senier's gone. Who's left, de Gaulle? Then he leaned back and literally thumped his chest and said, I am the king.
Since the advent of the intercontinental jet, American presidents have embarked on literally dozens of remarkable journeys. Often, world events or the unpredictability of some presidents leaves little time for advanced planning. Lyndon Johnson's military aide and pilot, Jim Cross.
President Johnson called me in my office there at the White House, and he said, Jim, I want you to get my big airplane ready. We're going to have to go over and pay our last respects to Prime Minister Holt. And I said, well, Mr. President, you might remember, sir, we put that big airplane in the overhaul hangar about 3 or 4 days ago, and you had approved its going. And in one of his very Texan-like homilies, he said, well, just run up there and get it back. He said, we're going to take that airplane. I said, Mr. President, I was up there yesterday, and I looked at the plane. It'd take at least 10 days just to put the pieces back on it. He said, well, I don't know why it is, but every time that some of you folks get to doing something, you mess up my plans. Says, see if you can find me another airplane, which we did. We took one of the backup planes. We fitted it out for him, more or less to his liking, so that we could take it. And 2 days later, we left on this particular incredible journey. We were gone just under 4 days. I think it was 121 hours. We spent 61 hours in the air, and we stopped in Honolulu. We stopped in Australia, 2 different places. We stopped in Bangkok, or near Bangkok, I believe it's Korat Air Force Base. We stopped in Karachi to see the president of Pakistan at that time. We then stopped to see the Pope on the eve of Christmas. I think it was the night of the 23rd. And we flew from there on to Lodges and then on back into Andrews. We arrived here, as I recall, it was Christmas Eve morning, about 7 o'clock, having been gone some 121 hours.
There was a bizarre, little-known ending to Johnson's final flight aboard the presidential plane. Ralph Albertazzi, Nixon's Air Force One commander.
President Nixon had made the gesture, of course, of wanting the now former president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, to go back to his home state in Air Force One. They got to Austin, of course, and when they got there, I got a phone call, not really a frantic phone call, but kind of a phone call of concern from Paul Thornhill. He said, Ralph, you're not going to believe this, but we've been ordered to take everything off the airplane. And when I say everything, they took the matches that had the presidential seal, they took the cigarettes that had the presidential seal, they took the tissues, the towels, the dishes that Jackie Kennedy had arranged to put on board the airplane that had special flavor and special significance to the airplane alone. All those things were gone. And the most important thing was that the conference room chair that the president used all the time, we call it the king chair, well, they took that seat off, too. So the airplane came back from Austin without the king chair and all the other amenities.
$26,000 became Richard Nixon's Air Force One.
So help me God.
Nixon ascended to the presidency partly because of his campaign pledge that he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. When Ralph Albertazzi signed on as presidential pilot, he hadn't the faintest clue he was about to become one of the prime smugglers of all time. The plan came directly from President Nixon. It involved clandestine flights to Europe, where National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was to meet secretly with the North Vietnamese. Dr. Kissinger.
I absolutely could not have conducted the shuttle diplomacy without Air Force One. And I might add, there were not many volunteers for that sort of thing in the rest of the administration. So we approached the Vietnamese through General Walters, who was then military attaché in Paris, and suggested a private dialogue, and they accepted it. What I often did, in fact, almost always did, is to go to some party in Washington and go straight from the party to Andrews and take off.
And he was always with some sort of an adornment called a pretty girl, and generally somebody well-known, and all of them beautiful, and he had developed a reputation for being a ladies' man as a result. But he would show up at these receptions and these things, and after a reasonable length of time making sure that everybody would see him, he would call for his White House car, would come up and pick him up, and they'd jump in the car, and off they would go into the night, with everybody in attendance suspecting that Henry was going out for a great weekend, you see. And he would drop the girl off at whatever place she was staying or her home and proceed to the airport, where he'd jump on the airplane, and we would head off for our meeting in France or Germany or England or wherever the case may be. Then we would get back some 24 hours later, 36 hours later, and Henry would make a show at the White House on Monday morning, and all the newspaper people would see him with these bleary eyes and worn expression, and they would think, my God, what a great weekend he must have had.
But it hasn't all been smooth flying. In April of 1970, there was an in-flight incident that nearly unmasked the secret negotiations and could have destroyed them forever. Enter Major General Vernon Walters, military attaché at the American Embassy in Paris.
Saturday, I received a phone call about 5 o'clock, very urgent, from Secretary Haig, who indicated to me that something had gone wrong with the aircraft.
as we were going along, the engineer came up and says, you know, we're losing hydraulic fluid. I don't understand it.
And they really needed to get to Frankfurt to get the hydraulic system fixed, and that they didn't want to land and take off and then fly with the landing gear down, because that would have blown the cover right there, since no one would have believed they flew across the Atlantic with the landing gear down.
So about 3 hours later, about 8 o'clock at night, 8:30, I got another phone call from him, and he said it's going to land at the worst possible place, Frankfurt, Rhine, Main, where he will certainly be recognized. And the North Vietnamese had told us that if there was any publicity, they would break off the negotiations. And you've got to do something. And I said, well, I will do something. And I wondered what I would do. I sat there maybe for 10 or 15 minutes after I hung up. And finally, I decided I'd walk up the street to the president of France's palace. I had just taken him around the United States about 2 or 3 months before, so I knew him a little better than the military attaché normally knows the president. So President Pompidou listened to my story, called his airplane at Villers-Coublay Airport, told me, go out there, and my plane will take you to Rhine, Main, and pick up Kissinger. We flew eastward, a beautiful night, and soon we pulled up behind the aircraft, the Air Force One. And we followed it into Frankfurt. It landed ahead of us. I walked up into the airplane, and Dr. Kissinger was sitting there looking rather dejected. And he said, am I glad to see you? What are we going to do now? And I said, Dr. Kissinger, take off your glasses, roll up your coat collar, walk down the ladder, walk up the ladder of the small French airplane. We'll move your baggage and your aids. And it's the only time in my life I've ever seen a meek, obedient Henry Kissinger doing exactly as he was told.
How Walters managed that, I will never know, because he not only had to track down the French, but he also had to square it with the Germans, and to square it with the Germans in a plausible way, so that they wouldn't check into who was on that plane.
We got in and took off, and about half an hour after we took off, the French pilot, Colonel Calderon, asked me to come up front. And he said, General, what am I going to tell the Germans? They know this is the President of France's airplane. They know that in the middle of the night, without getting a flight clearance, without filing a flight plan, we penetrated German airspace. The bells are ringing all the way from Switzerland to Denmark. The end of the story is simply this, that a couple of days later I saw the French pilot, and I said, Calderon, did the Germans come? He said, General Walters, when I got to my office the next morning, the German air attaché in uniform was waiting for me. And I said, what did you tell him? And he said, I told him what we'd agreed upon, namely that it involved a woman. And I said, did that satisfy him, or did he have any other questions? And he said, just one. And I said, what was that? He said, well, he leaned forward confidentially, tapped me on the knee, and said, tell me, is President Pompidou's lady German?
For those connected with the mission, it became known simply as Cherchez la Femme. It was 11:30 a.m., local time, February 21st, 1972, when Air Force One touched down in the capital of the People's Republic of China. Richard Nixon's flight had stunned the world. Then, and for the rest of that unprecedented journey, the world at large was treated for the first time ever to live color pictures of an American president moving through the exotic sights of mainland China. It was on the PRC pre-flight to arrange Nixon's visit that Albertazzi made a mischievous suggestion to Kissinger.
Colonel Albertazzi, who was a good friend of mine and a terrific guy when he didn't dive the airplane, was suggested that really to impress the Chinese, I should sit on the left-hand side of the cockpit as the plane was taxiing in for a landing, and make the Chinese believe that I had flown the plane myself.
The Chinese are going to look up and say, oh my God, he can fly too.
And I tell you, that was a tempting suggestion, because they had done more research on me, and they knew more about me than I did. But that's one thing they wouldn't have known, and it would have really created havoc in them.
Well, you know, he said, Albertazzi, tell you what I'll do it. Well, he didn't do it. And I used to kid him about it. And I remember subsequent to a lot of the things that took place, I was kidding him about it one time. He said, well, you know, Albertazzi, I'll tell you something. If I thought this administration had a sense of humor, I would have done it.
If Air Force One is the pinnacle of America's aviation and maintenance excellence, That has not always been the case with its Russian counterpart. It was during Nixon's 1972 Moscow summit with Leonid Brezhnev that Soviet airworthiness became the subject of some embarrassing world headlines. Frank Cormier.
Leaving Moscow on one occasion, we just sat and sat and sat. In fact, we didn't leave. We just sat there. And it was finally announced that there was some mechanical problem, and we would not be able to take this aircraft.
Former Air Force One navigator, Colonel Jim Bazzelli.
Shortly, we saw a covey of people just running over towards the aircraft, opening up the cowling, started looking around. And I turned to my Russian counterpart and I said, what seems to be the problem over there? I don't understand. And he looked at me and he was very serious and he said, I don't know, but somebody is in very big trouble.
The Russians were fit to be tied. They had made a huge issue of using their airplane, which they claimed was better than ours and safer than ours, or at least as safe as ours. Then we get on the plane, and the miserable thing wouldn't start. But Kosygin was the one who was most outraged by that failure. And considering that the Secret Service had been claiming all along that these airplanes weren't reliable, this was a huge embarrassment to them.
Press Secretary Ron Ziegler.
I had gone out at that time because I saw the press corps sitting there wondering what was going on. And they had blacked out the entire departure ceremony on Soviet television and every feed to the world.
During all of this, Premier Kosygin introduced to Nixon one of the ranking Soviet Air Force officers and said to the president, this is the man responsible for this, what shall I do with him? And Nixon said, well, by all means promote him because at least he found out what the trouble was before we got off the ground.
After 10 years of service, SAM 26,000 was replaced by a new 707, SAM 27,000.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The first presidential resignation in history.
As I recall,
Richard Nixon's final flight as president was at hand. Colonel Albertesi.
We set the stage, the crew, for this final departure as we normally would for any trip to California, with a backup airplane and the alternate crew and those kind of things. And one of the things that we had to do, of course, was to provide for the fact that the president, somewhere along that flight, was not going to be the president anymore. We watched his presentation. We have television capability on board the airplane. We watched his final remarks to friends and employees at the White House.
I want to say for each and every one of you, not only will we always remember you, not only will we always be grateful to you, but always you will be in our hearts and you will be in our prayers. Thank you very much.
We left Washington, D.C. Andrews Air Force Base at 10:17 in the morning. We were Air Force One.
Ford Press Secretary Jerry Terhorst.
The decision had been made by the National Security Council that on the final flight to San Clemente, the black box would not be on that plane, even though President Nixon would be president actually for almost an hour after he left the White House.
And just where was the little black box?
The black box, sometimes called the football, it's the box of the codes and the encoding ciphers which accompany a president of the United States wherever he goes, in this country or abroad. There's never more than an arm's length from him if he needs it in case of a nuclear attack. Because certainly when Jerry Ford became president at 12, the box should be with him and not on some airplane going west.
Chief radio operator Van Valkenburg.
It was a very quiet flight. We were instructed that Air Force One would cease being as of the time that Mr. Ford was sworn in. So I, being the chief communicator on that last flight, I called the audiovisual section in the White House. They in turn patched up one of the microphones on the podium where Mr. Ford was being sworn in. into the airplane. I monitored it. I put it over the PA system throughout the airplane so the people in the back could hear it.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability, preserve...
Something like 2.5 minutes after 12, 13 miles southwest of Jefferson City, Missouri, at 39,000 feet, when Gerald Ford said,
"So help me God."
So help me God.
We ceased being Air Force One, and we immediately then changed the call sign to SAM 27,000, and we proceeded to San Clemente with that kind of a call sign rather than Air Force One.
It was obviously a dramatic moment, a silent moment. But President Nixon handled that entire situation, I think, with great dignity. And, there was no substantial emotion that occurred, but I would say more or less reflection. But it happened on Air Force One.
Nixon flight steward Lee Simmons.
But later on in the flight, President Nixon called me in his compartment, and I had the opportunity, I thought, to get to explain to him how I felt and wanted him to know that it was a sad day for me. But really, before I could really get to him and tell him how sad I was and how disappointed I am this day is happening, he started to console me and tell me that, Lee, tomorrow's another day. You hang in there, keep your chin up, and hang in there and fight them all the way. He said, don't worry about a thing. Everything is going to be fine. And he got up and put his arm around me and hugged me and wished me and my family well. So I left out of that compartment with tears in my eyes, because here I was trying to console him, and there he was consoling me.
It was some 20, 25 minutes after the swearing-in ceremony, the president came out. First time that I'd seen him after the boarding of the airplane. And as he is wont to do, and perhaps some people who know him better than I do, but he had a tendency to roll his hands just a little bit. When he didn't put them in his pocket, he kind of rolled them around. And the way he looked around and looked at me, he said, Ralph, I promised you before we went to China, when we got back, I was going to make you a general. And he said, like so many things that I've got to leave undone. And his voice trailed off, and I said, I understand, Mr. President.
Former Nixon aide, Steve Bull.
Generally, crowds were generated during the Nixon presidency. We had a lot of things on our minds, and the last thing on our mind was generating a crowd out at El Toro. It was totally a spontaneous event, and it was very, very moving. I recall seeing strangers with tears in their eyes, and it was the final outpouring of emotion from a very turbulent and emotional period of time.
As I step off the Spirit of 76, this great plane that took us to China, to Russia on 2 occasions, to the Mideast, this great Spirit of 76 is one that we will always remember because of those trips.
Came over, we had this picture-taking session. Once again, he said, I'm sorry that it has to end this way. And I said, I understand, Mr. President. He walked over to the helicopter, and I saluted and turned around to the crew. And I said, well, folks, it's time to get this airplane back for President Ford.
When it comes to political campaigning, Air Force One is a very real plus for the sitting president. Ford Press Secretary Ron Nessen.
There's quite a bit of difference, especially during a presidential election campaign, and I guess presidential election campaigns now run the whole 4 years, between a candidate who arrives in a city in this great glistening symbol of American authority and power, and the other candidate who arrives in a chartered 727. And I think all presidents try to maximize the impact of that symbol. At one point in the presidential campaign of 1976, there was the idea that Air Force One when it was taking President Ford to some campaign stop, would make a low-level pass over the field and then turn around and land. And that is a very dramatic symbol of presidential authority, and it was to remind everybody that this was the president. The other guy was just a candidate who had to charter his plane.
For a time, the specter of assassination also dogged Gerald Ford, first in Sacramento, and then just days later in San Francisco. Former President Ford.
When I came out of the St. Francis Hotel, she took a shot at me. They pushed me in the limousine, and we made about as rapid a trip from the St. Francis Hotel to the San Francisco airport as one can imagine.
But Mrs. Ford had not been with him. She had been on a little separate trip of her own down to Monterey, and she arrived on the plane just a few minutes after he did, but not knowing what had happened.
She walked into the area where we were sitting, and her comment to me was, as she saw us sitting there, well, how did they treat you in San Francisco?
I think they were the calmest ones aboard the plane on the flight back, because there was a lot of nervousness on the staff about what had happened and what a narrow escape it had been.
There's no doubt that Air Force One, for all intents and purposes, is truly a very visible extension of the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. I might add, a president can get a lot of work done on Air Force One as he flies to Europe or as he flies to the Pacific. You had your staff there, you had all the intelligence information, the working papers. You could communicate with anybody, so it was a workshop as good as the Oval Office itself.
For President Ford, there were occasional embarrassments connected both with Marine One, the presidential helicopter, and Air Force One.
We landed in Salzburg. It was a very wet, rainy day. And as I came out of the Air Force One, I had an umbrella in one hand, and I was trying to hold Betty's arm with my other hand. And inadvertently, I tripped and took a bad spill. Fortunately, because I'd learned how to fall when I was playing football and competing in other athletics, even though I fell 3 or 4 steps, I rolled and got up and had no injuries whatsoever.
Thank you for your gracious welcome to Salzburg, and I'm sorry that I tumbled in.
After it all happened, I kidded Eddie and said, why did she push me?
On January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter became the 39th President of the United States. Perhaps no chief executive in recent memory was more dedicated to eliminating the ostentation of the presidency. His concerns stretched even to the amenities aboard Air Force One. Former President Carter.
Well, within the White House and the Oval Office, the working spaces that I occupied at Camp David on Air Force One, in my own private life as president, I tried to cut down the waste of money and the ostentatious nature of the presidency. Some of my predecessors, I say without any criticism, had given quite expensive gifts, for instance, to everyone who came on board Air Force One, kind of like it was a mercantile establishment where people would carry away mementos quite costly to the American public. It was just contrary to my nature. And so we did away with that element of Air Force One.
Press Secretary Jody Powell.
I personally was grief-stricken when I found out that he had banned the free cigarettes from Air Force One. It seemed to me that was one of the things I was looking forward to enjoying, is a free cigarette. So when you smoke as many as I do, then it makes a big difference. But I suspect in many ways, yeah, I mean, the doing away with the limousine for the White House staff and so forth, my impression was that nobody noticed that but us.
But people could always take with them a pencil or a scratch pad or a book of paper matches. just as a proof they had been on board the beautiful plane. But I felt quite at home on Air Force One, and always felt when I was there that I was not isolated up in the sky somewhere, but had direct access to members of the Congress, to friendly leaders of nations, and in case of an emergency that I could talk to the Kremlin or to any other place to deal with an emergency that might arise.
During the final year of his presidency, Carter was deeply involved in gaining freedom for 52 Americans held hostage in Iran. Their release stretched into Ronald Reagan's inauguration. The new president asked his predecessor to fly to West Germany and welcome back the former captives.
Getting those hostages home safe had been a preoccupation of the administration in which I served for over a year. It had finally happened. And I think all of us were certainly grateful to the new administration for making that trip possible, particularly possible under the circumstances in which it took place. And I remember coming back, one of the staff members had thought to purchase and have loaded on board some champagne to drink. And we were standing there in the president's cabin with a glass of champagne.
And my toast was to those who had shown through their stamina and patience and courage that our nation's principles were intact. And of course, my toast also included one to freedom.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and hit that notification icon for the latest videos as they are released. Thanks for watching, and catch you in the next one. Ciao for now.
Heading to Joint J6, Air Force One. Contact Memphis Center 128.47. 12847, Air Force One, good day. Good day. Memphis Center, good afternoon. Air Force One passing 7,300.